and get started. So as folks heard, the recording has started. We'll go ahead and get going with this. We've got an hour together. We'll have a Q&A at the end. And what I'm going to ask folks to do is put their questions into the chat as the speakers are going, but please don't try to answer other people's questions because we find that that can be really distracting. For folks, please just go ahead and we'll gather them and we'll ask them of the speakers at the end. So I'm Carol. I'm the Executive Director of MCAN. I'm excited to have everybody on tonight. I think you'll enjoy this webinar. This is a really interesting, hot topic right now. A couple of logistics. I've muted everybody. If you're having trouble with the audio, what I would recommend doing is calling in, and then you have the image on your laptop or your tablet, but you're listening via the phone. So like I said, we're going to do a moderated Q&A at the end, so just put questions into the chat box as they occur to you. We are, as you heard, recording the webinar, and we'll put it up on the YouTube channel, MCAN's YouTube channel, and put it on our website under the Past Webinars tab. We'll also send out a link to everybody who RSVP'd so that you can share with people in your communities or watch it again or whatever. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to do a brief introduction of the speakers. I'll talk very briefly about sort of why this matters, and then we'll get to the meat of tonight, which is Jesse's going to do most of the talking. As you guys heard, Lisa, who's an architect, will be available to answer questions at the end, but they'll sort of tell us about Brookline's experience and how it happened. And then we'll have a moderated question and answer at the end. Just a little bit about your hosts. This webinar is hosted by three groups tonight: Massachusetts Climate Action Network, or MCAN, the Pipeline Awareness Network, or PLAN, and Toxics Action Center. So just a little bit about MCAN. We were founded in the year 2000. We are a network, and we provide expertise to help town groups, our chapters in town groups, take action on climate locally, as well as giving them a voice at the state level on policies and programs. And we have a network of organizations that are more than 50 chapters that represent more than 100 towns across Massachusetts. Kathy, do you want to talk about PLAN?
Sure. PLAN is the Pipeline Awareness Network for the Northeast. We sort of formed in 2015 from existing groups, Mass Plan, New Hampshire Plan, BEAT, No Frat Gas, sort of grouped up to deal with regulatory and court issues. Our mission is there on the slide, but you can see how this work would play directly into what we try to do with communities and get them off of gas so that there's no need for both intrastate and interstate pipeline expansion. And I have to point out that I am also a conservation commissioner, and my commission meeting starts at 7:30, so I will only be able to be on this webinar for 1/2 hour.
We're glad you're able to join it all. So just to set a little bit of context for everybody, this is not news to anybody on this call, but climate change is happening right now, and it's happening right here in Massachusetts. So these are all photos from the last couple of years in Massachusetts of climate effects that we are already feeling, whether they're increased tornadoes, whether it's beach erosion on the Cape, whether it's flooding in Lynn, extreme weather during the winter, or droughts during the summer. We all know it's here and it's happening. The good news is that we can prove that this is solvable at the local level. So we are all about the local action, including town meeting, which was one of the reasons that we're so excited about what Brookline did, and so excited to hear from Jesse and Lisa tonight. Climate action has always started at the community level, and I think it's really important to remember that that's where all of the solutions that we now have in hand have come up from. I also just want to remind people that a better world is possible, that we know how to do this. We have the tools to build a better communities, a better state, a better society. And the reason that what Jesse and Lisa and the folks from Mothers Out Front and a whole group of fantastic petitioners did in Brookline, one of the reasons that that matters so much is that more than half of our carbon pollution in Massachusetts comes from buildings. Buildings consume a lot of energy and need a lot of heating and cooling, and so buildings are a really important piece of climate change solutions. And as folks probably know, at MCAN we do a lot of work on net zero buildings, net zero planning, and we feel very strongly that building fossil fuel-free buildings is the way that we can move into the future and have a better world. So, you know, obviously gas matters because A, it's a fossil fuel. It matters for the climate. It also impacts indoor air quality and health, and it's an equity issue based on where pipelines get put and who is put at risk from gas issues. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jesse to tell us about how Brookline happened.
Great. Thank you, Carol. So yeah, my name is Jesse, and I was one of 11 co-sponsors of Warrant Article 21, which we began thinking about in May. We filed as a warrant article in August, and it was passed on November 20th, just a couple weeks ago. It's a prohibition on new fossil fuel infrastructure in major construction, and I'm representing a very large team, not just the co-sponsors, but close to 100 people who have provided expert input and helped on the political work to get this passed. So the next slide presents what I want to talk about today. Briefly tell you what this bylaw is, why we decided to put forward this bylaw and how it fits with other policy at the local and state level. And what I suspect most of you will be most interested in is the process. So I'll talk about the process of how we did it. And then I'm going to actually skip over the rest of it and just go straight to the Q&A to try to address what you're most interested in. So that's the overview. The summary of the bylaw itself: this is a bylaw that prohibits installation of new fuel piping, piping that would have gas or oil inside it flowing through it. It only prohibits fuel piping on the customer side of a gas meter or from a storage tank on a property. And it is triggered by new construction or significant rehabilitation, which is colloquially known as a gut renovation. And even when it's triggered, it only prevents installation of new piping. It doesn't require any piping to be ripped out when doing a rehabilitation. This is intended to be sort of the lowest hanging fruit. Let's stop digging the hole, and then we can get ourselves out of it. It has a number of exemptions, some of which were necessary for technical reasons. So for example, central hot water systems for domestic hot water in large buildings, systems that provide hot water for an entire large building. There's really no off-the-shelf solution for heat pumps for that, and so we exempted those systems. We still require domestic hot water on a small scale, even in a large building, to be all electric, but we have that as a technical exemption. There's also an exemption for residential cooking, which is more of a political exemption, something that we did to gain broader support while only giving up a small fraction of the emissions reduction of this bylaw. There's an appeals process whereby if there's any unexpected financial infeasibility of doing all electric, or any unexpected practical infeasibility, that there's a process where we're creating a new committee called a Sustainability Review Board, and that committee will be able to grant waivers on a case-by-case basis in the cases where building permits are rejected. This bylaw would take effect on January 1st of 2021, so a little over a year from now. And so the final vote on this bylaw was 210 to 3 with 6 abstentions, and that sort of makes this look easy, but it wasn't easy. This was something that was right on the boundary, I think, of what was politically doable. It required hours and hours of education, in some cases hours and hours of education for individual decision makers, individual town meeting members. And this was something that a lot of people were skeptical about when we started. And it was only through enormous amounts of political work and that we convinced them. And the primary way that we convinced them is by convincing them that it's ready for prime time, that it's practical, that it's doable, and that it's cost effective also. So it was about practicality. Polar bears played no part in convincing people to do this, even though a lot of us get into this thinking that polar bears are going to help. So next slide. The rationale is that we have a climate goal for our town, which is 0 emissions by 2050. That goal is probably not an adequate one, but it's also a daunting one to get to. One key step that's going to be absolutely necessary is to stop installing new fossil fuel infrastructure, because when we install that infrastructure, it continues to produce emissions for decades. And so an overall strategy to get us to where we need to be is to, number 1, electrify everything, and number 2, clean up the grid. And it will help to reduce demand along the way. So this bylaw is focused on electrifying everything. And the reason for that is that the cleaning of the grid, although there's still work to be done, is a train that's left the station. And I think that's shown on the next slide, where the Massachusetts Renewable Portfolio Standard it will get us close to 60% renewable by the year 2050. And that's the existing policy, which hopefully will be accelerated by the legislature. And then on the next slide, you can see that through the Community Choice Aggregation Program in Brookline, where the grid mix includes even more renewables for people that are part of that program, which they are defaulted into and 90% of Brookline participates in. And again, that program could be accelerated in the future. So what all of this ends up meaning on the next slide is that a building that, and you can go one more to get the chart, a building, in this case a single family, 2,500 square foot single family home, that converts from gas to electric, heat and hot water, not only has an immediate 30% reduction in emissions for an otherwise equivalent building, but it gets a little bit cleaner every year as the grid itself gets cleaner, such that it's a 70% reduction in emissions by the year 2050. And we figure that based on the turnover of our buildings in Brookline, which is not that high, we might have 15% of our buildings from this policy fossil fuels free by 2050, which might be about an 8 to 10% reduction in the fossil fuel usage in our town. This is something a lot of people don't understand. Today, when you switch a building from gas to electric, it's an overall reduction in emissions of 30%. And that is actually assuming that that's for the 10% of Brookline that opted out of the community choice aggregation and is just using the Eversource grid mix. So it's the most pessimistic way to do this comparison, something a lot of people don't understand. Next slide. All right, so the other thing is that this is cost effective now. We have a lot of data on this that we could share. This is just one example. It was a study commissioned by MassSave, and building the all-electric version of a house turned out to be turned out to be roughly $6,000 cheaper than building the gas version. And that's why a lot of larger developers are already moving towards heat pumps and electric rather than gas. But it's probably more the smaller firms that are somewhat stuck in their ways. But it's not that we need to mandate this because it's not cost effective. Rather, it's that people are slow to change even when it makes financial sense. So next slide. Right, so towns do have authority under their police powers, and so do cities, to broad authority to protect the population, so long as the bylaws or ordinances that they pass are not repugnant to law. And what that means is they're not inconsistent with Constitution, federal or state law. On top of that, there is a specific authority to regulate gas within buildings, and this authority to regulate emissions has been instantiated through legislation such as the Green Communities Act. And of course, this is something that Brookline will need to do to achieve its climate action goals. Next slide. So the areas of state law and law in general that might preempt this bylaw that we spent the most time thinking about, these are areas where we might potentially be repugnant to law by doing this, are the building code and its enabling legislation, the BBRS enabling legislation, so building code, and the utility law, which is Chapter 164. Those are the two most related areas of law that we thought the most about. Next slide. However, we took careful aim to thread a needle to take the best legal shot on goal we could to have the most legally defensible bylaw we could. And for that reason, we are not regulating gas pipelines in the street. That would be prevented under Chapter 164, manufacture and sale of gas and electricity. We are not regulating the gas meters or the hookups. People call this a gas hookup ban, but it's not. It doesn't directly ban hookups. We hope that the effect of it will be that people will choose not to have gas hookups to their home, but this does not actually ban that because that is not actually something we have the power to do. It does not require removal of any existing equipment. It does not have any insulation standards because that would conflict with the building code. It does not have any energy efficiency standards because that would conflict with the building code. And it does not have any design requirements or equipment requirements or building standards because that too would conflict with the building code. So this is how we've done our best to thread this needle, although this is an area of new and unsettled law. And so really this is the best shot on goal that we could take. This is where the work needs to be done right now, is through legal innovation. We need to figure out how to do this legally, because this is something that's essential for us to do for climate reasons. Next slide. All right, so then there's a couple slides about process, and then we can move on to questions. So Brookline previously set a goal of zero emissions by 2050, and earlier in 2019, in March, hired its first full-time employee focused on sustainability, which was Sustainability Program Administrator Zoi Lin, who's a fantastic public servant and who actually recently resigned and is would probably be interested if any of you know of opportunities. She's a phenomenal force for sustainability. So under her leadership, she convened a town-wide summit that a couple hundred people participated in. It was a brainstorming session, and then based on that summit, set up a half a dozen working teams of roughly 10 people each to actually focus on action and to put forward legislation or warrant articles to move the town towards its sustainability goals. Next slide. And from one of those working groups, from that following that summit, came this particular warrant article 21. It was from the non-public buildings sustainability working group. These were just anyone who signed up to work on this team. It actually was something I wouldn't have put effort into myself. I would have just focused on putting this bylaw forward, but because Zoi Lin had established this new system, it was brand new, I chose to participate in it. And what it ended up doing is it sort of encouraged / forced me to do much more team building than I would have otherwise done, and that turned out to be essential to getting this done because it really did require a large team with lots of different skills. Lisa Cunningham on the call is an architect, one of 4. There were several engineers, a lawyer, and many other expertise elements that were part of this team. And there was also, pretty much from the beginning, a lot of political support, including 3 out of the 5 members of the Brookline Select Board. So next slide. One particular key was having staff whose roles included coordinating policy development and ensuring access to staff expertise for the purpose of policy development. So this was a warrant article that was sponsored by town meeting members and select board members. It was not put forward by staff, but it required enormous staff expertise to do right, and enormous staff resources to help coordinate the political process, which included, I don't know, 50 public meetings, perhaps. And so parts of the town that were involved included the building department, the planning department, the town council, and lots and lots of staff members were involved. Next slide. And so these are the groups that we convinced prior to town meeting. Town meeting was, in some sense, a victory lap because we already had most people's support, having gone through all of this process. We had a town meeting whip, and we had a process that focused on convincing key constituencies, and that's just part of our normal warrant article development process in Brookline. We threw on an extra 4 public listening sessions starting in August, just because we thought that it was important that there be a lot of engagement on this policy development. And in the end, we got the support of all of these groups listed, and most of the support was unanimous, almost all of it. And part of that was that we did make a few concessions, including we worked really hard with these groups on the waiver process and how the waiver applications would be reviewed so that people had the confidence that no one was going to be left out to dry, that this would work for everyone. And as part of this process, we also conceded that there would be an exemption for residential cooking as well. Next slide. This is just listing some of the concerns that came up. Mainly they were practical. Mainly the question was, is this ready for prime time? So, for example, do electric heat pumps work in Massachusetts? Can the electrical grid support all of this electrification? Are there people who can actually do it? What will happen when the power goes out? How much more will it cost? And a lot of fears about development in Brookline potentially being slowed by developers being unwilling to build in this way. So we convinced people by answering these questions with data. And we brought in experts from all around the Boston area, architects and engineers and developers who have experience building electric buildings. And these people were extremely convincing when they came into meetings and talked about their perspective. So in the end, people believed us. Next slide. I guess I got ahead of myself. Let's see. So the other thing we did is we consulted a lot of lawyers before getting started on this project to have the confidence that this was worth doing, that we had a chance of this standing up legally. It's interesting, one of the things we learned along the way, there was initially some opposition from, based on the idea that this might impact affordable housing and might make it more expensive to live in Brookline. And what we learned along the way is actually that affordable housing is, in many senses, leading the way on electric construction. And there's lots of examples of that, including in Brookline, in Cambridge, in Boston, in Amherst. Lots and lots of affordable housing projects, and one reason is that they can often save money. Another reason is that they're progressive people who are running these projects, and so that also ended up being something that was really important for convincing people that this was practical. Next slide. Right, so there's an interesting distinction in Massachusetts legally between towns and cities that is very relevant here. And the distinction has to do with the state has decided to protect towns legally. A lot of towns are very small and provide them with legal resources in the form of review of all town bylaws from anywhere around the state. Any bylaw that a town passes has to be reviewed by a special office in the Attorney General's office, which is called the Municipal Law Unit. They review for legality, so they're essentially predicting whether a bylaw would stand up under scrutiny in court, whether it's legal. And what's interesting is that they do not review any city ordinances, nor do they have any authority to do so. In addition, when they review town bylaws, they will only do it, because there's so many towns in Massachusetts and so many town meetings and bylaws that are passed, they will only do it after the bylaws are passed. So there is really no way to have them pre-review. And so, you know, we talked to a lot of lawyers. We reached out to this office. We got a sense of how they operate, but there's no predicting what they will decide in an area of very new law. But even if they find, so they may approve it, they may reject it on fundamental grounds, and perhaps more likely than that, they may find that it would need to be implemented a little bit differently. They may find a more narrow problem. But if they find any kind of problem, that would not prevent a city from doing something like this. So it's particularly helpful in terms of providing, sending a signal to state-level policymakers, particularly helpful for building pressure, helpful for taking multiple legal shots on goal. It's particularly helpful for cities to pass ordinances that are like this, so that we can really get multiple perspectives on how to do this and whether it can be done in a really strongly legally defensible way. For the waivers, I mentioned we set up this SRB, Sustainability Review Board, and one way that we think about the legal issues is that if there's not a lot of opposition, if you can convince people this is practical, and if the choice that developers face is to either comply with a bylaw like this or to contest it, that if it's easier to comply with it, if it's cost effective and it's time, it's pretty quick, and if it's generally just practical to comply, a smart developer will comply rather than a contest. If it would take longer and be more expensive. That's not to say that there might not be someone with standing, a developer with standing who may be convinced to fight this in court, and who may be supported by the deep pockets of the fossil fuel industry, the American Gas Association or the American Petroleum Institute, both of whom were in Brookline watching this very closely and fighting it at the last minute. But by building a broad consensus and having a very practical bylaw, that's the best way, perhaps, to insulate ourselves from potential lawsuits. Let's see. Next slide. So that's pretty much it. All of this is just to say that we should stop digging the hole by installing new fossil fuel infrastructure. At some point, we're also going to have to get ourselves out of the hole, and that will require something that's much harder. It's really easy when you're building a new building or when you're doing a gut rehab to not install fossil fuel systems. It's harder to take them out of buildings when you're not doing that kind of work already. But we're going to have to do that too. So we better get started on the easy part. So that's really all I wanted to make sure to say. And with that, I think we could take some questions.
Great. Thanks, Jesse. So we are to the question and answer portion. I'm just going to leave this slide up so that folks will have access to it. So so that folks know we've started a listserv, which we can go ahead and invite everybody who is on the webinar. We'll go ahead and invite you guys to this over the next couple days to the listserv, and then you can either decline if you don't want to be on it, or you can join it, which means that you'll get emails from folks as they think about doing this in their communities. Jesse and Lisa, I've got a bunch of questions for you guys. I think one of the things that you started talking about a little bit, but maybe folks would like some more detail on, is sort of the process of who grants exemptions. Is there a process already in place for that? And what made you choose the exemptions that you did go ahead and put in there?
There's sort of two separate things going on here. Number one is there are exemptions that are written into the bylaw, and those were decided as part of the political process. We proposed some from the very beginning. For example, we exempt emergency generators, which we think is pretty important. That's an example of what I would call a technical exemption, something that there's really not a great technical substitute for that can achieve the same functionality. And so that's an exemption that's written in. We also negotiated as part of the process of winning votes in town meeting, and so as I mentioned, there's an exemption for residential cooking that came out of that negotiation. There's other exemptions that are baked into this that are written in that are specific. There's also this separate process, which is a waiver process, which anyone can apply for. And that process is a process where people would apply. They could apply based on schematic designs or based on fuller, more complete designs, and a committee of at least 3, but probably more like 5 people, which would include HVAC engineers and architects, but they'd be volunteers. It's a committee that's yet to be formed. Would develop their own internal guidelines and would, on a case-by-case basis, decide whether and whom should be exempted. So that's the waiver process.
Great. So a couple folks have asked, does the exemption for cooking, is that for all cooking? Does that mean that homes can still have gas stoves in them?
Yeah, so it is an exemption for all cooking. Part of our thinking was that there's so much work to be done on climate that that it is really important to have a broad consensus. Our sense became that we're at a point in history where people are still quite attached to gas cooking in ways that even just a few years down the road they probably won't be. In addition, if you've banned every other gas appliance in a home and you're building a new home, you start to be pretty strongly disincentivized to install gas ovens or gas cooktops or gas ranges. Furthermore, gas cooking is less than 5% of the emissions from burning gas in our buildings. And so for all these reasons, we figured, why not take 95+% of the emissions reduction and do it with a big tent, a big political tent, so that when it comes time to do the harder stuff that we're also going to have to do, we've laid some groundwork for that. And so that was our political judgment around around exempting residential cooking. There were a few people who were pretty significant in the process here who really fervently wanted that exemption and who would have fought us tooth and nail had we not included it. And I suspect this bylaw still would have passed, but we would have had, instead of a celebration victory lap at town meeting, we would have had an actual fight and an actual debate. There were no speakers against at town meeting, but there would have been speakers against if we had not exempted gas cooking. And we felt that the better strategy, bigger picture strategy, would be to exempt it.
So, Lisa, maybe you can answer this one since you're an architect. Folks are wondering how the builders reacted, particularly around single-family homes, and what kind of the reaction of the built environment community was to this.
Well, thanks, Carol, and thanks so much for having this seminar. It's really exciting to be bringing this to a larger group of people, and we're really hoping that this will start a movement with other towns in Massachusetts and across the country. So it's great to be a part of this. Actually, that's a great question. We did have, as Jesse mentioned, 4 open meetings where the town invited a large number of contractors to come and list their concerns. In the end, not that many contractors showed up, and I think that's because they are realizing that the times are changing very quickly as well. They're seeing from their own clients how concerned people are about our climate crisis. I know in my own practice that the contractors that I'm working with right now are just very, very interested in doing all electric systems. We're doing a ground source heat pump house 3 blocks from Brookline Town Hall, and the contractors have never done a project like this, and they are just really, really excited about it, really eager to learn. I've also been to a number of seminars, some that MCAN has actually sponsored, and these seminars are just completely packed with contractors and owners as well, learning about air source heat pump installation and ground source heat pump installation. So I would say that in general, the reaction was actually very positive.
That's great. Can you actually, we've got a couple questions about kind of how the public input sessions went and how well they were attended and that kind of thing. Can you just tell folks a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think we actually invited something like 2,000. Is that right, Jesse? 2,000 people?
Yeah, it was about, that's right. It was anyone who had pulled a permit in Brookline in the last however many years. That's literally how it was decided. It was taken from town records.
And I think people actually did. I know from some of the contractors that I was working with that they heard about this. We got a little bit of immediate attention, and so some people saw some local broadcasts about this. But in the end, I'd say we had people that would come and ask questions at these public meetings, and then there were also a number of people who had come to express their support and were also very knowledgeable about construction techniques. So there was a great interchange at these meetings because, again, it was a process where we could listen to people's concerns and listen to their questions, and then we could answer them. And for us, having that kind of rigorous questioning actually really strengthened our process and strengthened our warrant article, because we would then be able to go back with them back and answer these questions with very hard data and very convincing data, and that proved to be very affirming.
One thing that worked really well in those sessions is that they were mediated by the town sustainability program administrator, Zoi Lin, who has a background in mediation and negotiation. And so she was phenomenal, and she managed them in particular not as debates, but as problem-solving sessions. So we started out talking about the problem that we were trying to solve, what the proposal was to do it, and then she asked people to hold up little stickers that were different colors depending on whether they had a concern or a solution. And she called on people and alternated between concerns and solutions, and but keeping it productive, not getting bogged down in debate in the way that so many issues end up getting bogged down here in Brookline. And it's phenomenal what can be achieved with that kind of approach. And in fact, a testament to it is that there was a gentleman at one of these sessions who was probably the person who was most vociferously opposed at any point to this proposal. And but you know, he had a chance to speak and be heard, and I think that mattered more than the fact that, you know, we had answers to his concerns, but that helped too. And he kept coming to meetings. And in the end, actually, this is someone who decided, you know, who became a supporter, who bought an induction cooktop, and who donated to support the legal research that we had accumulated some debt to fund. And so this is one particular conversion story. It really helped, actually, in this case, that we exempted cooking, because it was really sort of almost like a libertarian objection to that kind of intrusion. And so, but through the mediation and through the concessions and through the repeated engagement, this was an opponent who became a supporter.
So I think related to the idea that one of your opposition ended up donating to support the legal research, somebody was wondering how you guys, when you were gathering all of these experts and consultants, did you pay them? How did you find them? How did that piece of things work? Can you both talk a little bit about that?
Lisa, do you want to
sure.
say something?
Sure. So we no, we didn't pay our consultants. We did end up deciding that we needed some high-level legal assistance at the end. So we did hire a lawyer who, for a discounted price, but who has been helping us out, and that turned out to be really valuable to us. But we developed a huge network just by having 4 architects on our team and more architects that we were connected to within the community. The same thing with engineers. We went to seminars and we developed relationships with people, and we just asked them to join us and help us. And these people were extremely, extremely helpful. And I think it's not that hard to find people. There's an incredible network of architects in the greater Boston area who are doing these projects now, and engineers. And they have a vast knowledge of these types of buildings. But having them testify in front of some of these town committees was really important, particularly since they weren't they weren't co-petitioners, they weren't part of our team, so they were seen as independent voices. So that was really, really useful.
And actually, if I could just jump in, this is Carol from MCAN. We've been working with the U.S. Green Building Council on getting a net zero stretch code done at the state level. And they recently did a letter that more than 1,500 built environment professionals, so architects, energy engineers, planners, signed. So if folks need help finding someone in their community, we can absolutely, or nearby, we can absolutely be helpful with that, because I think Lisa's point is really well taken. It's super important to have somebody like that who is not necessarily on your team, but who's willing to come speak for your issue. Sorry, keep talking, you guys.
Well, I'm seeing a question about Passivhaus, and so we did actually have experts in Passivhaus come and speak. And as Jesse pointed out, we aren't able to regulate anything concerning the building code, but we did have them come and speak. And actually, building a better building envelope is really important in terms of lowering energy and lowering the loads of the heat loads of buildings. And it also contributes to the cost efficiency of these buildings as well, because although the costs are in general, there's not much cost difference between all electric and conventional fossil fuel, but where you can really see a cost difference is in the operational costs when you build a better building envelope, and then your operational costs go way down because you have a much more efficient building and you have a much more efficient system, and you don't require the same loads that you would from a less efficient building. But again, as Jesse pointed out, that's not something that we have the ability to legislate, but we did have people at our community meetings talking about that, and there was a lot of discussion about that.
Yeah, that's one reason that the trigger for this is not just like, your boiler needs to be replaced, or not just like you're remodeling your kitchen. The trigger for this is you're building a brand new building, or you are doing a gut rehab of a building. And the reason for that trigger is that those are your opportunities to air seal and insulate. And so that was our best way of coordinating with existing efficiency standards, and with the fact that it is a little bit more expensive for an identical building. It's an emissions reduction to switch to electric, but it's a little bit, very slightly, more expensive to operate that identical building on electric. However, that small difference in operating costs is fairly small compared to the gains in the cost savings that you can get from air sealing and insulating. So you have every opportunity when you are air sealing and insulating to end up, when you do a rehab, for example, with a building that is less expensive to operate than when it was prior to the renovation, when it was a gas building. Because even though the electric will be a little bit more expensive, the load is much lower.
And I just want to say on that, one of the things based on this and what happened in Berkeley, one of the things that we've been working on at MCAN is we've been gathering case studies, including the ones from Jesse and Lisa's list of all electric buildings in Massachusetts. And we are actually trying to also get our hands on electrical bills for people who live in these buildings. So we will be putting out probably like a mini report that's going to be case studies on all electric buildings. We should be doing that probably next month or maybe February. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And Lisa and Jesse, one of the two questions that I think are very related, one is, can you just remind folks how long the process took from inception to completion, and then kind of what the outreach and education tactics and methods were along the way? Can you just remind folks how that worked? And how
you want to take the first? You want to take the first part, and I'll take a shot at the second part, or?
Great. So yeah, I mean the warrant article process, the town meeting legislation process, has a deadline that was August 30th, and so that was when we formally submitted this, but we had done a lot of legal research before that, so starting in May and June, a lot of legal research, and some practicality research, but not that much. And then after filing it on August 30th, we really started doing research in earnest. And I would say, there were about three or four people who pretty much worked full-time on this for a couple months. And there were a bunch more people who worked maybe half-time for a couple months. And so part of the answer of how we were able to get this information, build these networks, is that there were a lot of people working really hard. So back to the timeline, filed August 30th. There were lots and lots and lots of meetings starting in September and getting really heavy in October, and then a couple in November, and then town meeting on November 20th. So that was the timeline. And then I guess I should add. I guess I should just add that the Attorney General's municipal law unit could take until July to make a determination. We hope it will be sooner, but it could take until June or July for them to make a determination, and then the effective date is January 1st, 2021.
So in terms of education outreach, first of all, I just want to echo what Jesse said, that this was really a team process. We had a lot of people. There were 11 co-petitioners. As Jesse said, there were several people who were working on this more than full-time, I'd say double full-time, and there were a lot of people who were working very, very hard to contribute to this effort. So we had, I'd say we had 20 people who were doing education and outreach, probably closer to 25 people throughout all the town meeting members. There are 240 town meeting members, and each town meeting member was approached individually and we engaged in a conversation with them and about the warrant article. And some of those conversations took 15 minutes, half an hour, but some of those conversations took hours and spread over into days and involved not just one person but several people and in dialogue. And the reason why is because we wanted to make sure that everybody really had a full understanding of what our warrant article was about, how practical it was, what the economic considerations were. We wanted to make sure that we answered everybody's questions. So there were a lot of questions about the electrical grid. There were a lot of questions about feasibility, practicality, or even just what the warrant article covered and didn't cover. And that isn't something that we could cover. We didn't want to cover that over an email discussion. We wanted to cover that over a very calm and measured discussion where we, again, and I do want to compliment Zoi Lin on this, again, our sustainability director, but she really set an example for all of us of listening to people's concerns very seriously, hearing them, and then trying to honestly answer them and keep answering them so that we could keep giving them more information to allay their concerns and then make them a member of our team.
Great, thank you. And I think as this goes on, probably and more communities do this. Although it's fabulous what Brookline did in terms of actually talking to every single town meeting member. Hopefully, as things move on and this becomes more normal, it won't be required to speak to absolutely every single person. We have a couple of questions about, we got a little teaser. I think, Jesse, you said this about the gas and oil, the sort of fossil fuel industry attempts to kind of slow this down or stop this towards the end. And I'm just wondering if you can tell folks just a little bit more about that, since people are likely to face that in their own communities as well.
Yeah, I would say I would summarize it by saying that the fossil fuel industry came too late to help us. And what I mean is, I don't think that they are resourced or equipped to actually succeed in a town by town, city by city battle on this issue. In part because I just don't think they're very compelling at a local level where there's not a lot of influence of money on politics, especially not in town meeting. Nobody spends any money to get elected to town meeting. So they also came very late, but the American Gas Association works with a PR firm in Washington called, I believe it's called Dermo. I might have the name slightly off, and they followed this and they reached out to at least one person that they thought might be opposed, who was a former select board member, and we had brought him on board. He was a strong supporter by that point, so he just forwarded the email to us. But they were reaching, they were reaching out trying to co-opt people, and they have a front organization, which I think is called Sustainable Energy or something like that, that's been revealed in a Huffington Post article to be a front organization for deep-pocketed fossil fuel interests. And they also reached out to other advocacy groups, including, I suspect, I don't have concrete evidence in some of these instances, only in others, but there's a realtor association that reached out to us, and a laborers council that reached out to us, and in the 2 days before the vote. So all town meeting members got 3 emails that I believe were initiated by outreach from the AGA, American Gas Association, and but I think it had zero impact on the final vote because nobody really cared.
Which does speak to the community organizing that you guys did. So we are just about at 8 o'clock. So what I'm going to do is, as I said, I will invite everybody to be a part of the Google group /listserv. Folks have asked, is the slideshow going to be up there? Can we have the warrant article and explanation? We've got a folder in a Google Drive, which you will also all get access to. Folks are also asking if they can, Jesse and Lisa, if they can have your info sheets. So what I will do is that I will gather everything that Jesse and Lisa are comfortable giving us, and I will put that into the Google Drive so that everybody who joins the Google group has access to it. And I know that somebody had asked, or maybe a couple people had asked who it was that was going to put out the all-electric buildings case studies set, and that is Carol at MCAN, so keep your eyes peeled on the Google group for that. And I just want to give a huge thank you to Lisa and Jesse and the Mothers Out Front group in Brookline and Climate Action Brookline and everybody who really led the way and achieved this major victory, this first one in Massachusetts. And we're really excited to see where it goes from here. So thanks, you guys, for being on the webinar.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting.
Bravo.
All right.
How's,
Thank you, Carol.
Can you hear?
Thanks, everybody. Okay.
I hope so.
Bye-bye.
Well, I guess I can't hear.